I noticed her on my 23rd day at Vel'Orani Station Bravo. That is not the beginning of the story, but it is the beginning of my awareness of it. The story had already been running for 6 weeks before I arrived. It had been running through forms and queues and intake corridors and deferred classification stamps, and she had been sitting at the end of it, on a gray bench, waiting for something that never arrived. I just happened to be the person who finally looked in the right direction. I want to be precise about that. I was not looking for her. I was not looking for anyone in particular. I was a compact frontier medic 4 months into a posting I had accepted primarily because the alternatives were worse. Assigned to the medical assessment annex of a joint resettlement processing hub on a border moon that smelled like recycled coolant and old paperwork. Vel'Orani Station Bravo was not a place people chose. It was a place the compact sent people who were technically qualified for the posting and not currently doing anything more urgent. That description fit me precisely, and so there I was, in an annex off the main intake corridor, running basic medical clearances on the resettlement arrivals who cycled through from 3 different collapsed colony sites in the Vel'Orani contested sector. I had been at postings like this before. Not identical postings, the specific moon, the specific species profile, the specific administrative architecture of the intake system all varied, but the same fundamental category of place. A hub where displaced people arrived in large numbers and were processed by a system that was well-intentioned and chronically under-resourced, and where most of the staff were decent people doing their jobs competently within whatever parameters the system gave them, and where, occasionally, someone fell into the gap between 2 parameters and stayed there. Every posting had them. The system was not malicious. It was just a system, and systems have edges, and at the edges there are people who do not quite fit the framework's categories, and the framework is not designed to go looking for them. I was not designed to go looking for them either. That was not my job. My job was medical assessment, step 4 of a 9-step intake process. I assessed, I cleared or flagged. I treated what needed treating. I passed the file to step 5. That was the whole of it, and I was good at it, and for 22 days I had done nothing else. The hub processed approximately 200 arrivals per standard week. Vel'Orani, mostly, with a smaller fraction of Keth secondary species who had been caught in the same collapse event. They came off the transit shuttles in groups of 40, were sorted into numbered queues, and moved through the intake system in an order that had been designed by someone who had never actually watched it operate. Medical clearance was step 4. Most arrivals reached me within 3 hours of landing. They sat in the chair across the examination table, answered the standard assessment questions through the translation module, received their clearance or their treatment note, and moved on to step 5. I did not know Sarath Vale's name on the 23rd day. I did not know anything about her except what I could observe from the doorway of the medical annex, which was a partial view of the intake corridor, and the long gray bench that ran along the far wall beneath a row of identification panels. The bench was where the processing system sent people it did not know what to do with. In the intake system's formal language, this was the deferred classification queue. In practice, it was the bench where arrivals sat until the end of the day, were told to return tomorrow, and returned the next day to sit again. She was sitting at the far end of the bench, near the recycling duct. She was slight, even by Vel'Orani standards. Gray-blue skin, the kind that in certain light looked almost silver. Close-cropped hair, very pale, nearly white, cut short enough that it sat flush against the shape of her head rather than lying in it. Her eyes were large even for a Vel'Orani, dark and reflective, the kind of eyes that registered everything at once and gave nothing back. She was wearing gray transit clothes, the standard-issue fabric that arrived in a sealed bag on the shuttle, and was the same gray as the bench and the wall and the floor, as though the resettlement system had decided that people in transit should not stand out in any environment. She had her right hand tucked into the left side of her transit jacket, halfway to the elbow. I noticed that detail, the hand tucked away, because I was a medic and details like that were my professional habit. A hand hidden at rest, when the temperature did not require it, when the posture was otherwise composed, was a detail that had a limited number of explanations, and most of them were medical. But I did not act on it on the 23rd day. I looked at her for approximately 4 seconds, registered the bench and the tucked hand and the dark reflective eyes staring at the middle distance in front of her, and then went back to the medical assessment. I was running on the Vel'Orani woman seated across from me, a colony teacher who had injured her ankle in the evacuation and needed a follow-up on the brace fitting. I saw Sarath again on the 25th day. She was in the same position on the same bench, right hand tucked away, transit clothes still gray. She did not look at the identification panels above the bench. She did not speak to the other people waiting on the deferred seats, though there were sometimes 2 or 3 of them. She sat with a quality of stillness that was not patience exactly. Patience implies expecting something, but a more austere kind of endurance, the quality of a person who has decided that the present moment is what it is and is engaged in getting through it rather than waiting for it to end. I saw her on the 27th day and the 29th. On the 31st day I asked Prel Sorveth, the intake coordinator for the station's Vel'Orani processing stream. Prel was a compact civil administrator, not Vel'Orani, assigned by the same logic that had assigned me. He was qualified, available, and not currently doing anything more urgent. He was thorough in his way, meticulous with the official records, and he had a particular manner of explaining bureaucratic realities that managed to sound like common sense while quietly foreclosing every alternative. I found him in the intake coordination office at the end of the corridor, which was a room slightly too small for its desk and slightly too cold from the ventilation duct above it. I asked him about the Vel'Orani woman at the end of the deferred bench. He did not ask me which one. He said her name was Sarath Vale. He said she had arrived on a transit shuttle from the second Vel'Keth colony collapse 41 days ago. He said she had a degenerative nerve condition in her right hand, present since the collapse, and that this had created a complication with her placement classification under the standard Vel'Orani skills and capacity framework, the hub used to assign resettlement positions. I asked what kind of complication. He was patient about explaining it. The Vel'Orani placement framework organized arrivals by demonstrated capacity across 12 skill categories. Placement offers were extended by receiving colonies and station postings based on those capacity scores. The framework had been in use for approximately 30 years and was, Prel said, generally accurate and efficient. The complication with Sarath Vale was that her nerve condition affected her scores in 4 of the 12 categories, in ways the framework did not have a correction mechanism for. 2 of those 4 categories were ones that Vel'Orani receiving communities weighted heavily in their placement requests. The result was that her capacity profile did not match any of the open placement requests in the current queue, and so she had been placed in the deferred classification, while a matching placement was sought. I asked how long that search typically took. Prel said it varied. He said some deferred classifications resolved within 2 weeks. He said Sarath Vale's case had certain characteristics that made it more complex than average. I did not ask him to specify what those characteristics were. I had worked with enough bureaucratic systems to understand when a man was telling me something by not saying it. The characteristics were that no Vel'Orani receiving community was going to request a placement for an arrival with a visible physical impairment, because the Vel'Orani view of such impairments was not the compact's view, and the framework was designed to match arrivals to communities that had requested them, and no community was going to request her. The deferred bench was not a waiting room. It was a place to keep someone while the system avoided acknowledging that it had no intention of placing her. I said thank you and went back to the medical annex. I spent 2 days thinking about it. I was not an administrator. I was not assigned to placement or intake coordination. My domain was the Medical Assessment Annex, Step 4 of the process, and my job was to assess and clear or flag and treat, and then pass arrivals to Step 5. What happened at Steps 5 through 9 was not my area of responsibility. I thought about this for 2 days, and it did not help. On the third day, I went to the rear courtyard. The rear courtyard was a small outdoor space behind the station's main processing block, accessible through a door at the end of the medical annex corridor. It had been designed as a utility space, an area for equipment storage and ventilation access, but someone at some earlier point in the station's history had placed a stone bench against the wall and left it there. And at some still earlier point, a tree had grown up through a crack in the paving stones and had continued growing until it was approximately 4 meters tall and had a spread of branches that in the late afternoon caught the light from Vel'Orani 4 primary sun in a way that made the courtyard feel, for a few hours each day, like a place where something other than administrative processing was occurring. I had discovered the courtyard in my first week, which was when I discovered most of the station's features that were not listed in the orientation materials. Postings like this one had a habit of containing small spaces that the official documentation did not mention, because the official documentation described the station as it was intended to function, and not as it had actually evolved over years of occupation and use. The rear courtyard was one of those spaces. I ate my lunch there most days when the weather permitted, which on Vel'Orani 4 meant most days in the current season. The tree was the reason. I had always preferred working environments that had something growing in them. I went there at the end of the afternoon, after the day's medical assessments were finished. I sat on the bench for a while. The light came through the tree branches in the way it did. I thought about what I was going to do, because I had already decided what I was going to do, and the thinking was mostly the process of confirming it to myself. The next day I ate my staff canteen meal at my desk, and at approximately the midpoint of the afternoon, carried a second tray from the staff canteen to the rear courtyard and set it on the stone bench. The tray had what the canteen was serving that afternoon: a protein portion, a grain portion, a vegetable component, something warm in a covered cup. The Vel'Orani dietary parameters were on file. The canteen adjusted for them automatically when you logged a tray against a specific intake number, which I had done, which was a feature of the canteen system that most of the staff did not know existed. Then I went back inside and told the intake corridor's queue management system, a compact administrative software platform with a polite tone and a small amount of discretion about its operational parameters, that the Medical Assessment Annex required an additional follow-up evaluation for an arrival classified under deferred status for medical documentation purposes, and provided Sereth Vale's intake number. The queue management system considered this for approximately 3 seconds and then routed her to the medical annex. She appeared in the annex doorway 4 minutes later. She was not pleased. She had been on the deferred bench for 42 days at that point, and her experience of being routed to different parts of the intake processing system had not, I suspected, produced outcomes that would make her inclined toward optimism about new routing events. She stood in the doorway with her right hand tucked into the left side of her transit jacket, and her dark eyes moving across the room with the careful economy of someone who had learned to identify exits before she committed to entering any space. I told her I needed to do a standard follow-up medical documentation check, which was partially true. I did need to document her nerve condition properly, because no one had done a thorough write-up and it would matter later. But I kept it brief, because she was not interested in the medical assessment beyond the minimum it required, and pushing for detail she had not offered would have been the wrong instinct. I did what I needed to do. I documented the condition accurately and in full, the way it should have been done 42 days earlier, and I updated her medical file. Then I told her there was a meal in the rear courtyard and showed her the door at the end of the corridor. She looked at me for a long time. Vel'Orani eyes are large enough that when a Vel'Orani looks at you without the mediating softness of small talk or social ritual, you are aware of being looked at very precisely. It is not an uncomfortable experience, exactly. It is an experience of being examined. She examined me with the same care she had used on the doorway and the exits, and I held still for it, because flinching would have been the wrong instinct too. She said nothing. She walked to the door at the end of the corridor, opened it, and went into the rear courtyard. I heard the door close. I did not follow her. I went back to the medical annex and did the afternoon's remaining documentation, and after approximately 40 minutes I heard the door open again and the sound of footsteps in the corridor, and then the outer door to the intake area opened and closed, and she was gone. She had taken the meal. The tray was on the stone bench when I went to collect it at the end of the day. The covered cup was empty. I noted this without making anything of it. I brought the tray back to the canteen's return station and went to the staff quarters. I did not speak to her about it the next day, because she did not come to the annex the next day, and I did not route her there. I did not do anything visible for 3 days. I was thinking, and I was doing research, and the research was taking some time because the compact's administrative systems for resettlement processing were not designed to be interrogated by someone who was not an intake coordinator. But I was a medic, and medics have access to medical records, and medical records are linked in ways that intake administrators do not always think about carefully. I could see what I needed to see. I spent the evenings of those 3 days in the medical annex, after the rest of the station's processing staff had ended their shifts, reading. What I was reading was the Vel'Orani skills and capacity framework, specifically the 12 assessment categories, and the methodology by which scores in those categories were derived, and the way those scores interacted with the placement request database. And I was reading Sarath Vale's intake file in parallel, the full file, not the summary that had been routed to the deferred queue, but the complete documentation that the intake assessment at arrival had produced. She had been a structural assessment apprentice in the second colony. The Vel'Orani second colony had been a terraforming settlement, a long-term project, expected to span decades, requiring a specific and technically skilled population. Structural assessment work in that context meant evaluating material stress distributions in prefabricated colony installations, a job that required precision and patience and the ability to read complex data outputs and translate them into practical decisions about maintenance, reinforcement, and replacement. She had been doing this work for 2 years before the collapse. Her capacity scores in that work, derived from the colony's own records, which had been transferred to the hub's intake database, were high, very high. The nerve condition in her right hand meant she could not perform physical manipulation tasks that required fine motor control under load. That was 4 of the 12 capacity categories. The scores in those 4 categories were flagged as impaired, and those were the categories that the placement framework weighted most heavily for Vel'Orani communities, because Vel'Orani communities were, in most cases, labor-oriented settlements that needed hands. But structural assessment was not hands work. Structural assessment was data work, analysis work, documentation work. The 8 capacity categories where her scores were not impaired were the categories that described what she actually did, the work she had actually done for 2 years in a demanding technical environment, the work she was demonstratingly good at. No one had looked at those 8. The framework did not tell them to. The framework had flagged the 4 impaired categories, and the impairment had filtered her out of the active placement queue, and no one had looked at what remained. Prel Sorvath was meticulous and thorough within the framework's parameters, and those parameters did not include a step that said, when 4 categories are impaired, check the other 8. I looked at the other 8. There were exactly 3 open placement requests in the current hub database that matched an arrival with strong structural assessment capacity and no requirement for fine motor manipulation. One was a small research installation on the Keth secondary system's outer margin, which was looking for a documentation specialist for their long-term atmospheric study. One was an administrative expansion at a Vel'Orani secondary settlement on the far side of the sector, which had logged a request for someone who could manage structural compliance records for a new construction program. And one was a data analysis support position at a transit engineering depot in the Central Station cluster, which had put in a general capacity request that, when I read the full specification rather than the summary, was looking for exactly the skill set her file described. 3 matches, 42 days of the deferred bench, and there were 3 matches sitting in the database waiting. I sat with this for a while. Then I opened the placement request form, not the intake coordinator's routing form, which required Prel-Sorvath's credentials and which I did not have, but the medical documentation supplemental form, which allowed a medic to append a clinical capacity addendum to an arrivals file when the standard intake assessment had not fully captured the medical dimensions of that arrivals capability profile. This form had a provision for detailed skills notation, where a medical assessment suggested that the standard framework scores might not reflect the full clinical picture. It was a narrow provision. It had been designed, I suspected, for situations involving recovery from injury or illness where capacity was expected to improve, not for cases where the standard framework had simply failed to look at the right things. But it did not say that. It said, clinical capacity addendum, to be filed when the medical assessment supports additional or corrective notation. I used it. I wrote the addendum that night in the medical annex, alone. The annex was quiet in a way that working spaces are only quiet after the last person has left, not silent, because the ventilation unit was running, and the documentation terminal had its own low hum, but quiet in the sense of no competing human presence, no foot traffic in the corridor, no queue management announcements from the intake system. Just the space and the work. I wrote in the plain factual language that medical documentation required, which was not the language of persuasion but the language of evidence. I described the nerve condition accurately and in full, the etiology where it could be established from the colony medical records that had transferred in her file, the specific nerve pathway affected, the scope of motor impairment across the 4 flagged capacity categories, the clinical basis for expecting the condition to be stable rather than progressive. And then I described what it did not affect, the 8 capacity categories that remained intact, the specific nature of her documented structural assessment work in the second colony, the colony's own performance records, the cross-reference to the 3 placement requests in the database. I wrote each sentence once and did not revise it. The clinical record format did not benefit from stylistic revision. It benefited from accuracy and completeness, and I had both, because I had spent 3 evenings reading her file and the placement database and the framework methodology before I sat down to write. I did not editorialize. I did not write about the 42 days on the bench. I did not write about the gray transit clothes or the right hand tucked away in the jacket, or the fact that she had gone into the rear courtyard and come back out 40 minutes later and not said anything. None of that was clinical documentation. I wrote about structural assessment methodology and nerve conduction damage and capacity scores and placement compatibility, in the correct clinical register, with the correct citation format, and I filed it with the medical annex's documentation system under the supplemental form provision. The system routed it automatically to Prel-Sorvath's intake coordination queue, as supplemental medical documentation required. The filing timestamp was 22:37. I noted it when the system confirmed receipt. I went to the staff quarters and slept. I had been a medic for 12 years, and I had learned that there was a point at which the thing you could do was done, and the rest was waiting. And it was better to sleep during the waiting than to stay awake watching the inbox. Prel Sorveth arrived at the medical annex at 8:20 the next morning. He was not hostile. That would have been a simpler thing to manage. He was professional and precise, and he explained, with the careful patience of a man who had explained similar things before, that the medical supplemental form provision was intended for clinical capacity documentation that bore directly on an arrival's medical treatment plan, not for intake placement recommendations, which were outside the domain of medical assessment, and that while he appreciated the thoroughness of the documentation, the placement framework operated within specific procedural parameters that required intake coordination review. I said I understood that, and I said the documentation I had filed was clinical capacity documentation that bore directly on the completeness of the medical record, because an incomplete medical record that misrepresented an arrival's functional capacity in ways that produced ongoing deferral constituted a medical concern, and that I had filed accordingly. There was a silence. Prel was a precise man. He had worked within systems his entire career, and he understood the internal logic of procedural frameworks the way a structural engineer understands load-bearing walls. He could see where I had filed and why it was defensible, and he could see that arguing against it in formal terms would require him to assert that an incomplete medical record was not a medical concern, which was an assertion he could not make without it becoming a larger problem for the station's administrative review process. He said he would review the addendum. I said thank you and went back to the medical assessments. Prel reviewed it. He reviewed it for 2 days, which was longer than it needed but shorter than it could have been, and on the second afternoon he filed a routing update on Sareth Vale's intake case that reclassified her from deferred status to active placement review, and flagged the 3 database matches for coordinator assessment. The placement review took 5 days. The Transit Engineering Depot's request was the fastest to respond. They had apparently been waiting for several weeks for their open position to generate a match, and when the routing arrived, they reviewed her documentation the same day and sent back a placement offer within 48 hours of receiving the referral. The placement list was posted on a Tuesday morning, the standard weekly posting, on the intake corridor's public display panel near the numbered queue markers. I saw her name on it when I came through the corridor on the way to the medical annex. I noted it and kept walking. There were 11 medical clearances scheduled for the morning, and the first appointment was at 8:30. She came to the medical annex at 9:40. I was between appointments, updating a treatment note for a Vel'Orani man who had needed a respiratory assessment, when I heard footsteps in the annex corridor that were not the footsteps of the hub's standard foot traffic. The intake corridor had a particular sound, queue shuffling, administrative briskness, the measured pace of people moving between steps, and these footsteps were different. They were slower, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who knew where they were going, but was not certain what they were going to find when they arrived. I turned from the documentation terminal. She was standing in the annex doorway. The transit clothes were the same. The gray jacket, the gray trousers, the close-cropped pale hair. She had been on the station for 49 days now, and the transit clothes were beginning to show it, washed frequently enough but not new, carrying the particular weariness of clothing that had been the only clothing for a long time. She was thin in the way that people become thin when they have been in transit conditions for an extended period, not dramatically, but noticeably, as though some small percentage of her had been quietly spent somewhere in the preceding weeks and had not yet returned. Her right hand was at her side, not tucked away, at her side fully visible, the fingers slightly apart. I could see the tremor from where I was standing, a small, constant motion, barely larger than a shiver, the kind of thing that happened below the threshold of conscious control, the kind of thing she had spent 49 days hiding inside a jacket sleeve whenever anyone official was looking at her. She was looking at me with her large dark eyes, and this time the examination was different from the one in the doorway on the day of the courtyard meal. That look had been careful and assessing, the look of someone evaluating exits. This look was something else. It was the look of someone who had arrived at a question they did not entirely know how to ask, and was standing in the doorway with it rather than finding a way to carry it back outside. I did not speak first. There was a principle I had developed across 12 years of medical work, which was that when a patient was standing in a doorway with something they needed to say, the worst thing you could do was fill the space before they said it. The space was necessary. It was doing something. Breaking it with the wrong word at the wrong moment could close a door that had taken a long time to open. She stepped into the annex. She stopped in front of the examination table, which was between us, and she looked at me, and the trembling was visible in her right hand, and she did not tuck it away. Then she said, in the careful, measured way that indicated she had assembled the sentence deliberately rather than pulling it from a fluent reservoir, "Human." The word landed differently than it would have in another context. It was the specific address, not my name, not a formal title, but the species designation used in direct address. And in Vel'Orani usage, when a Vel'Orani chose to address a person directly without using their formal station, without the intake system's transactional language between them, using the simple species name, it was not impersonal. It was, in some registers of Vel'Orani interpersonal practice that I had read about in the Hub's cultural context documentation, one of the more direct forms of address available. It said, "I am speaking to you." Specifically to you, the species name becomes a name. She said it, and then she said the rest of the sentence. She said, "What have you done for me?" The Vel'Orani translation layer that the standard sentence carried was doing a great deal of work in that phrase, and I was aware of it, because it was not a simple question. In Vel'Orani grammatical structure, the construction she had used was not the interrogative of unknowing, not the question of someone who did not understand what had occurred and was seeking information. It was the interrogative of reckoning. It was the question asked when a person already knew the outline of an answer and was asking because the saying of it aloud, between the person who had done the thing and the person it had been done for, was itself part of the thing. It was an accounting. She was asking me to account for myself, and the asking was acknowledgement. Her right hand was trembling at her side, and she did not tuck it away. I said, "I filed a medical addendum. It documented your clinical capacity profile more fully than the original intake assessment had. The placement framework picked up 3 matches from the database. The depot on the transit engineering station was the fastest to respond." She was quiet for a moment. In the way of Vel'Orani processing silences, which were not the same as human uncertain pauses, but were instead the silence of someone whose internal operations were running very fast on very precise inputs. She said, "You used a medical form." I said, "Yes." She said, "For a placement problem." I said, "I used it for a medical documentation problem. The documentation had not fully captured your functional capacity. That was a medical documentation gap. I filled it." Another silence, shorter this time. She said, "Prel Sorveth did not change the classification until after your form was filed." I said, "That's right." She said, "He would not have changed it otherwise." It was not a question. I said, "I don't know that. I didn't ask him." She looked at me with an expression that communicated, very precisely, that she considered this last statement technically accurate and practically irrelevant, and that she was not bothered by the distinction. There was something in her face that I had not seen in the doorway encounters or the 49 days of peripheral observation. It was not warmth exactly, not yet. It was the thing that precedes warmth, The recalibration that occurs when a person who has been operating under a particular set of assumptions about what the world is going to do is presented with contradictory evidence and has to revise. It was the expression of someone updating. She said, and her voice was different on this sentence, and the translation layer carried something that the standard words alone did not fully contain. Rail Dorn. My name, in the Vel'Orani second form direct address. I knew what the second form was because I had read about it in the same cultural context documentation. The Vel'Orani had several registers of personal address, and the second form was the form used between persons who had moved out of the space of pure transactional relationship. The intake form relationship, the queue relationship, the system relationship, into something else. It was not the intimate first form, which was reserved for family and for bonds formed over years. It was the form for someone who had been seen and who, by being seen, had become worth naming correctly. It was precise and intentional, and it was the first time in 49 days that she had used anyone's name on the station. She said my name the way a person says something they have been deciding whether to say. I held still for it. Then I said, "The transport to the depot leaves in 3 hours from Bay 4. I checked the schedule this morning." She absorbed this. She looked at me for another moment, the dark reflective eyes doing the careful work they always did. Then she nodded once, the particular Vel'Orani nod that was an acknowledgement rather than a farewell, a gesture that said, "This has been received, it is going into the record, it is not being set aside." She turned and walked out of the annex. I heard her footsteps in the corridor, slower than the intake system's rhythm, deliberate. I heard the outer door open and close. I stood in the medical annex for a while. There was a documentation terminal to my left, and the examination table in front of me, and a shelf of medical supplies to my right. And the morning light was coming through the annex's small window at the angle it came through at 9:40 on Cathara Roman 4, which was a flat gray-white light that was adequate for clinical work, but not particularly interesting to look at. I thought about the form in the filing cabinet. The medical supplemental addendum, Form C7 in the Compact's clinical documentation series, filed 9 days ago, listing her skills accurately and in full in the clinical register that the framework required, cross-reference to 3 placement requests and 1 clear match. A single form in a cabinet in a room off a corridor in a resettlement hub on a border moon. The most ordinary administrative act available in this environment. The third scheduled appointment of the morning arrived in the doorway at 1003, a Vel'Orani man who needed a follow-up on a respiratory assessment from the previous week. I pulled up the relevant file and waved him in and began the appointment. The transport to the Transit Engineering Depot left Bay 4 at 1300. I knew because I had checked the schedule. I did not go to Bay 4 to watch it leave. There was no reason to. The bay was on the other side of the station. I had a full afternoon of assessments, and the maintenance request for the ventilation unit in the annex was going to require a coordination call at 14:30, and the documentation backlog from the previous week had been accumulating in a way that was going to take 2 focused hours to process correctly. I did the afternoon. At the end of it, when the last appointment was finished and the documentation was current, and the ventilation coordination call had been made and the annex was quiet, I went through the door at the end of the corridor into the rear courtyard. The late afternoon light was coming through the tree branches the way it came through them at this hour, which was the best hour for it, warm and low, catching the upper branches, and coming down through the gaps in a way that was not quite dappled but was not quite flat either. The stone bench was cool under the light. The tree had put out a few new leaves in the past week. I had been noting the progress. Cathara Roman 4 had a growing season of sorts, short and unreliable, and the tree had adapted to it over however many years it had been growing through the crack in the courtyard paving stones. It knew its conditions and it worked within them and it grew anyway. I sat on the bench for a while. I thought about her right hand at her side, visible, the tremor in it, the fingers slightly apart, and the way she had not tucked it away. I thought about the second form address and the way she had said my name, and what the saying of it meant in the register she had used it in. I thought about 49 days and a queue system, and a framework that had not been designed to look at the right categories. I thought about a structural assessment apprentice who had spent 2 years doing precise technical work in a demanding environment, and had been sent to a deferred bench because 4 out of 12 scores were impaired, and no one had looked at the other 8. I had looked at the other 8. That was what she had asked me to account for, and that was what I had accounted for. I had looked at the part the system had not told anyone to look at. I had written down what I found in the correct clinical language and filed it in the correct place, and the system had done the rest, because the system could do the rest. It had the placement requests, it had the database, it had the machinery. It had simply needed someone to hand it the complete information. This was, by most measures, a small thing. It was not a dramatic thing. No one had shouted or confronted or fought. No one had defied orders or broken rules. I had filled out a form using a provision that existed for exactly this kind of clinical documentation gap, and I had filed it, and Prel Sorvath had reviewed it and made the routing update, and the placement review had found the match, and the Transit Engineering Depot had made the offer. The form was in the filing cabinet in the annex. Form C7, Clinical Capacity Addendum. 1 page and a half, in the standard clinical format, with the cross-references properly formatted and the citation index at the bottom. I had not done it because I expected her to thank me. I had not done it because I wanted the station to know I had done it, or because I thought it would improve my standing with the administrative review process, or because someone had asked me to. I had done it because the documentation was incomplete, and incomplete documentation was a medical concern, and I was the medic. That was the whole of it. There was no larger architecture behind it. There was just the fact of the incomplete documentation and the form that existed to correct it, and the willingness to sit in the annex alone after the end of the shift and fill it out correctly. But she had come to find me. She had come to find me, and she had stood in the doorway with her right hand visible, the tremor in it steady and unmasked, and she had used the second form address, and she had said my name, and she had asked the question that was not a question but an accounting. And I had given the account, in plain language, without inflation, because that was the only way to give it honestly. And she had absorbed it, and she had nodded, and she had walked to the transport. I sat with that for a while, in the courtyard, in the late afternoon light. Then I went back inside. I had a documentation backlog that had not been entirely cleared in the afternoon, because the ventilation call had run long, and there was enough remaining that I could reasonably spend another hour on it before the day was properly closed out. I went through the door, down the corridor, into the annex. I sat at the documentation terminal and opened the pending file queue. I worked through the remaining items, one by one, in the order they had arrived, giving each one the attention the clinical record required. At the end of the queue there was one final item, Sarath Vale's medical file, which the system had flagged for closure upon confirmed placement departure. I opened it, reviewed the file to confirm it was complete. It was. The addendum was filed and the cross-references were intact, and the departure timestamp had been logged automatically at 1300 by the Bay system, and I closed it with the standard completion notation. The system moved it to the archived file set, and the queue was clear. I turned off the documentation terminal. The annex was quiet. The ventilation unit was running at the adjusted setting from the afternoon's coordination call, which was marginally less loud than it had been, though still present. The shelf of medical supplies was orderly. The examination table was clean. The filing cabinet in the corner was closed. I turned off the annex light and walked out. In the corridor on the way to the staff quarters, I passed the intake processing area, which was empty at this hour, the numbered queues silent, the display panel for the placement list running the current week's posting on a slow cycle. I did not stop to look at it. I had already read it this morning. Her name had been on it. That was the thing. That was the whole of the thing when I reduced it to its irreducible form. Her name had been on the placement list, in the correct position, with the correct placement designation, in the correct format, because the documentation had been completed and filed and reviewed and processed, and the system had done what the system was built to do when it was given complete information. She had come to find me, she had said my name, she had asked the question. I had answered it. I had answered it in the only language that was honest, the plain language of what had actually happened, the form and the provision and the documentation gap and the 8 capacity categories and the match in the database, stated without inflation and without apology and without the self-diminishment that would have made it seem like it was less than it was. It was not less than it was. It was what it was, a medic who filled out a form correctly. She had received that answer and she had given it the weight it deserved, which was more than I had expected and less than I might have wished, and that was exactly right. She was a structural assessment professional. She evaluated things accurately. She had evaluated this accurately, and she had assigned it the correct weight, enough to come and find me, enough to say my name in the second form, enough to stand with her hand visible. And then she had gone to the transport, because the transport was where she needed to be. I walked to the staff quarters. The border moon's night was coming in through the corridor windows, not dramatic, just the slow darkening of a sky that shifted from gray-white to gray-blue to something darker at the edges, the lights of the station's exterior systems beginning to register against the dimming. Cathara Roman 4 had no particularly notable night sky. The stars in the contested sector were ordinary stars. But the tree in the courtyard would look different in the morning, the way it always looked different at the beginning of each day, depending on the light. I would check it in the morning. And there would be another shuttle arriving in the morning, and another intake batch, and another set of medical clearances to run, and the documentation terminal would have a new queue, and the examination table would need to be ready, and the filing cabinet would have room for whatever the day produced. I would be there. That was what I was. A medic at a posting on a border moon, doing the job with the information available, and looking at all 12 categories when the system only pointed to 4. That was enough. It had been enough. Her name was on the list. It was going to stay on the list in the archived record, a permanent notation. Rail Dorn, Clinical Capacity Addendum, Form C7, dated and filed. Her skills listed accurately. Her placement confirmed. I went to the staff quarters and slept. In the morning, the tree in the courtyard had 3 more leaves than it had the day before, which was not a remarkable thing, except that I counted them, and the number was 3, and the light was coming through them at the morning angle, which was different from the afternoon angle but not worse. I opened the medical annex. I turned on the documentation terminal. I pulled up the first assessment of the day. I did the job.